Okay, go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of the UAA conference. My name is Stephanie Begay. I'm a member of the UAA board and am a representative from the University of Utah. I will be monitoring the chat / the live event Q&A session for today's session. And I also have the pleasure of introducing our lovely presenters for today. Before I turn the time over to them, I wanted to quickly share that the links for next week's sessions, so for week 3, will be sent out early next week, so keep an eye out for that email. And then we will also be sending out information on how to access the recordings from both week 1 and week 2 very soon. So with that, I'd like to introduce our presenters. So we have Ashley Holt and Christy Hoffman from UVU with us today, and they will be sharing the do's and don'ts of intercultural communication. So Ashley, Christy, the time is now yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So we're really excited to be with you today. We're going to be talking, like Stephanie said, about some kind of an overview and some basics around kind of best practices for working with students who are maybe coming from a different cultural context, maybe coming to the U.S. for school out of country. We're also going to be talking about some specific things around non-native speakers of English. So hopefully we've got a good mix of people with experience and maybe some less experience in the crowd today. We're going to be doing some scenarios at the end, so you're more than welcome to pipe in and participate with those. And we're going to get started just with a little bit of background about each of us. So my name is Christy. I'm an advisor in the First Year Center at UVU, and I've been advising in Utah for about 5 years. I come from a background in adjunct teaching at college campuses, both at the University of Oregon and Brigham Young University, Hawaii, where I worked with a lot of international students in my role as an instructor and also as a writing tutor. And so I have just really enjoyed kind of that experience and working with students and kind of picked up some kind of best tips and practices along the way. I also taught intercultural communication at BYU Hawaii. And so I'm happy to be here and talking with you all today.
Okay, awesome. My name is Ashley Holt, and I have been at UVU since January. Prior to that, I worked at Dixie State University, where I was involved with international students in a few different capacities, did some international admissions and recruitment and various activities within the International Student Services Office. So it was a time that I really enjoyed and still get to engage a little bit with international students here as an advisor. So we are excited to present for you today. I think we're just going to get our slideshow pulled up again. I think there was a little bit of a technical error, so bear with us for 1 second.
That's my fault. So sorry.
Totally fine.
Okay, we are, okay, is that working now?
So, Christy, I think it's not in presentation mode.
Okay, so it's in presentation mode on my computer. That's really fun. Cool deal. Do you want to try and get it on yours instead?
Sure, give me 1 moment.
While we're working on that, I'll give you some early access to our scenarios so you can be thinking about those while we're presenting. So our first one is about a student who comes to you and expresses some concerns around their living situation. They aren't super comfortable with talking to their roommates about some of the conflicts that they have, and they're coming to you for advice and want to know how to resolve that situation. Another one is a student who is trying to get an exception to a policy for late withdrawal on your campus and has been denied. Comes to you to talk about next steps, but brings several gifts with them. And you're getting the impression that you think that might be because you know, they're hoping for a change in that decision and kind of how you should handle that moving forward. And then we also have a scenario around when you're talking with a student and you're checking for understanding, but you're not confident that when they say they understand that that things are kind of, that you're like not totally sure about how much that kind of confidence is playing out. So kind of how would you respond there? And then the last one is about dropping classes as an international student. A student comes to you and is feeling overwhelmed. They've just started school and they want to drop some classes, and how you should proceed there. So be thinking about that as we talk. Okay, I can see that on my end. But you're muted, Ashley, so sorry.
Perfect. Okay. So there we are. So the first thing that we wanted to go over was just really the international student population in Utah.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The PowerPoint went away.
Okay. Well, we are struggling, but we will get this. Thank you. Okay, how about now?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay, wonderful.
Got it.
Awesome, thank you. So for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar, SEVIS stands for Student Exchange and Visitor Information System. So that's essentially where all the information for students who are here on an F or a J1 visa is housed. So according to the 2021 March SEVIS report, there are 8,520 international students in Utah, and they're pursuing language training, vocational training, or some sort of post-secondary degree. Of that population, 57.7% are male and 52.3% are female. As we begin to know our international students, the better we can understand where they come from, the more we'll understand their cultural background and how to work with them. A note here is you'll notice that SEVIS breaks them down by continents, which is a start, right? But this is kind of a good example of how sometimes we can overgeneralize. Just because someone is from Asia, they might not share the same culture as someone. Two people, one from China, one from Japan, they may not share a whole lot of similarities, but it is at least a start for us. So you can see here that, excuse me, Asia is the country or the continent where most students are coming from. Second, we have South America, North America, that's going to be mostly Canada. And then you have Africa, Europe, and then Australia and the Pacific Islands. Down here, we have populations of specific schools. We weren't able to find information for every school, but we kind of wanted to give you a sample so you have a general idea of kind of what we are looking like among our schools here in Utah. So here at Utah Valley University, we have a little over 600 students and we represent about 80 countries. These numbers are pre-COVID. Things could have changed slightly. If someone from these other schools has different information, feel free to correct me. But Dixie State, they have about 132 students with 38 countries represented, and the University of Utah is at about 3,000 students with 150 countries represented. So as you can see, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of different countries represented among our schools. So beginning to really think about and be intentional about interpersonal communication among different cultures is something that we need to be aware of. So let's see here. I'm actually gonna come over to, oops, I think it skipped a few things for me, I apologize. Got a little bit out of order for me here. One moment.
One thing that I'll kind of interject with while Ashley's working on that is that when international students look at a lot of these numbers in particular, you know, they tend to, there's some kind of, like most of us, big name schools tend to get a lot of attention. There's also really interesting perceptions around how international students want to interact in these different spaces. So my family hosted an international student from China who was exploring colleges while she was working in high school, and her parents were really, really invested in her going to school in Chicago because they felt like Chicago was a super, super safe place to be, is what they kept going over. She had been visiting kind of lots of different places and was like, oh, I kind of like Utah. I kind of like, where I am in West Virginia. But they were like, nope, Chicago's safe. That's it, right? And so a lot of the ways that like the perceptions about the US from outside of the US also impact some of these choices around where they go to school and all those things that we often don't have a sense of, like those perceptions outside of the country.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christy. So we did want to take a second to talk about common challenges that international students face. The more we're aware of these challenges, the better we can engage with students in a meaningful way that's really intentional and really use language and explanations that are going to make sense to them. So one thing to consider is that these students are coming into a brand new education system, so they may not be familiar with letter grading or with the 4.0 scale. As an advisor, this can be especially important as you discuss things such as academic standing, or maybe you advise for a program where there are specific matriculation requirements, and so they need a certain GPA for a set of classes or overall GPA. Making sure they understand that can be really important. Also, in some cultures, being able to copy something is seen as a very positive thing, right? You're really accurate. You can copy this so well. I've seen this in particular with students from China, and so the concept of plagiarism is totally new to them. And so I know that a lot of times this type of thing is addressed in orientation with international student services. But this is a good thing to be aware of as an advisor. If a student comes to you and is talking about assignments, it's good to be aware of that and put in that plug if you think that there can be some misunderstanding. Other cultures, they tend to value the art of storytelling, which can really impact how they write academically. Rather than focusing on research and formal language, they might put a lot of effort into elaborately expressing their personal feelings on a subject. And I think that this can be an opportunity for us as advisors to point them to resources such as the Writing Center. The other thing that's really important is that international students, when they're here on a visa, they don't have a really long time to graduate. So if you've been working with a student for a few semesters and they suddenly want to change their major, I wouldn't do that without talking to your International Student Services office. That's something you can do with the student so you're all on the same page. Maybe you have advising from the International Student Services office at your university. If you don't, maybe that's something that you could reach out to them and ask for. It's helpful when you're all on the same page because these students have a certain amount of time with which their visa is good and they can be in the country pursuing their academic pursuits. So you just want to make sure that you're not changing them to a major that they don't have the time to complete. So just be aware of that. Another thing is a lot of times you're going to be experiencing a very different support system. Most international students, I would say, are coming from a background where this idea of coming to the US and getting a degree, this educational goal has kind of been the goal of their whole family, right? And that can be a good thing because they have support at home, they're well prepared, but it can also leave them feeling a little bit like, who's here to take care of me? Like, why am I on my own? And they might wonder why some faculty or staff members aren't more involved in their lives. For example, I had a student one time who became eligible for CPT, which means they can work off campus if it's a job related to their degree. And they asked me, okay, well, if I'm able to do CPT in the future, who's going to drive me to work? And the student wasn't being needy, wasn't trying to be dependent or rude. It was just a very, very different circumstance for them, right? Those things had always been taken care of for them in the past. And so they weren't sure, it didn't occur to them that that would be their responsibility. But that's a really good opportunity, again, as advisors to be like, hey, do you know that in the community we have a public transportation system? And this can vary from school to school, but sometimes students can get free or reduced pricing for public transportation. So again, another opportunity to make them aware of their resources. And quit sharing again.
It did.
All right, I apologize. My goodness, guys, we will figure this out. 1 second. Okay, there we are. Can you see the new culture and country slide now?
I can. Thanks,
Awesome.
Ashley.
Perfect. So this is from a designer. Her name is Yang Louis, and she wrote or produced this book called East Meets West. And she's talking about her experiences in Europe versus her experiences in China. And it's kind of fun because she uses these pictograms to just quickly give us an idea of some cultural differences that we can easily overlook. And so let's see here. This first one right here with these lines, the blue line indicates the typical noise level of a Western restaurant. In the East, these larger lines, these are going to represent the typical noise level of a restaurant in Eastern countries. Same thing here. This is talking about the transportation evolution. We had cars in the 70s. Now people are a little more green, a little more health conscious. Whatever the reason, a lot of times bicycles are our mode of transportation. It's very opposite in a lot of Eastern countries. The idea of having a car can be new to them, and it's exciting, and it's what they prefer. Down here, you can definitely see this a lot if you're working with a large group. This blue line indicates how we in the West typically form a line, one single linear line. In a lot of Eastern countries, it's very normal and acceptable to form a line kind of as a big group, just huddled around, and it makes sense to them. It works totally fine. The one that I think is most relevant to us as advisors is this picture right here. And this is talking about how we deal with problems. So it's very common. There's always different personalities in every culture, for sure. But typically in Western culture, it's viewed as acceptable to address a problem politely or to advocate for yourself when circumstances arise. In Eastern culture, that can often be seen as rude or invasive or just improper. And so a lot of times you'll see this play out in a few different ways. They might have a problem speaking to a professor or not realize that that's acceptable if they're confused or they don't feel like a grade is fair. Maybe it's a situation with roommates or even with you as an advisor, as you're asking questions and you're not so sure that they understand. They may not feel that it's okay to state that, like, oh, sorry, I don't quite understand. They may not have the language or the practice doing that. So that's another way that we can help as advisors. And then I think I'll turn that back to Christy.
Awesome. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes. If it will let me go.
Awesome. So I know lots of us are, probably in a position where we're like, I've got a pretty good sense of like other cultures. I feel pretty culturally aware. I know for, a lot of our campuses, that's a big kind of priority. And this is something that this iceberg concept of culture is something that I really like, because I have to think about this all the time with myself, is that the tip of the iceberg, the stuff that's on top of the water, is a lot of the stuff that's the more visible parts of culture. So the arts, literature, drama, different forms of music, dance, games, cooking, dress, those are all the things that are really easily identifiable with culture. And so we might have a good sense of how that works within our own culture. We might have a good sense of different regional cultures, how that works. I may feel like I am just really comfortable with, I know a lot about India, right? I really like curry. But all of these things under the iceberg, right, under the water here, are the bigger parts of culture, right? We have these outward expressions of culture, but really you're going to notice that this section is so much bigger and has so much more interaction with how we work with ourselves, how we work with others, our values, all the things that are important to us essentially as humans. And so, this can be anything from what does it mean for something to be clean, right? And, when your house is tidy, what does that look like versus an untidy house? What your relationship is to people in authority, what kind of eye contact is appropriate in certain situations. This was something that I came up against a lot in my work, especially at BYU Hawaii, is that there were times where we were getting a lot of guidance to be making eye contact in certain situations, that it was really important that we were making and holding eye contact with people, and that was deeply, deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. And some of that's just personality, right? Like if somebody's just giving me a dead stare, I don't love that either. But in a lot of cultures, that just is like totally unheard of in some different ways. And so a lot of this is stuff that we can't always be like on top of all the time. We're not saying like, if you have an international student, I want you to absolutely know what their relationships are to animals in their culture and how they understand the role between humans and animals, right? That's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is that that there are so many more pieces to this than we often give attention to, and that all of these things are likely impacting moments where we might be in a situation where we're feeling like we're maybe uncomfortable, or where we are in a situation that we're not sure how to best proceed. And so that, you can kind of say, okay, this might be an intercultural moment. This might be kind of the source of that. And it might be coming from under the iceberg or from under the water there. Right, next slide. Okay, so here are some kind of basic do's and don'ts. This is by no means a comprehensive list. This is one that we kind of just put together in terms of a lot of stuff that we see commonly, as well as some guidelines that we found from researchers. So one thing that I found was really helpful for me when I was working with students, especially on writing projects and when I was working with students via email, is that sometimes it's really easy to go through and be like, ooh, like, we're not working, I don't understand, like, I'm having a hard time here. And a good reminder is that if you don't know what a present participle is, your international students do, almost guaranteed. And so I have a master's degree in English, and I could not for the life of me tell you what a present participle is, or a participle, quite frankly, just because grammar wasn't a huge part of my education and how that worked. But when these students are coming in and working in a different language, their grammar, their understanding of the grammar of the English language is quite really, really impressive. And so if you are seeing some, if you, are having a hard time, or if you're seeing kind of mistakes in emails and things like that, that's okay. They're still working on it. And, and they've got basically just different strengths with the language than native speakers do. One big thing you're going to notice, you're probably thinking this about me right now because I'm a very fast talker in presentations, is that we all need to slow down a little bit. So especially with non-native speakers of English and people who might be coming in from a different cultural situation, kind of processing all of the information, if you're doing internal translating, all that kind of takes time. And so if you're having a conversation where the person you're speaking to is speaking quite fast, that is really, you're going to miss stuff basically. And so what you want to avoid here is not, you know, like slowing down with that kind of condescending. Obviously, I don't think anybody's around here being like, oh yes, I am just so excited now I can condescend to my students. But, you know, just being mindful of the speed that we're speaking at and consciously kind of choosing to kind of take it down a little bit. Open-ended questions are always a good practice in advising, right? I don't think any of this is like mind-blowing advising information, but with international students and with students from other cultural contexts, these open-ended questions allow for a lot more discussion and a lot more opportunities for you to ask the follow-up questions where you might either see some gaps or see some things that are worthy of kind of talking about of like, that's awesome. Whereas kind of the yes/no answers aren't going to give you those kinds of opportunities. Clarifying questions are especially important when you're working with students who are non-native speakers of English. So kind of those opportunities to check in and say, you know, how do you feel like we're going so far in terms of like, do you understand everything? Is there anything that would be helpful for us to cover again? If they say something and you're not sure kind of what you're like, I think I understand what they mean, a good response to that, if you're, you know, if you're not confident that you understand, is, okay, I want to make sure that we get everything right. I want to make sure you have all the right information. So I'm going to let you know where I think we're at with this. You tell me if I've got it right. And again, this is just kind of good advising practice, but it becomes especially important when you're working with students from that, that other cultural context. Giving time to after asking questions is really important, especially for non-native speakers, because a lot of times you might be doing that internal translation of you're listening to the response, you may be translating, and then you're thinking about your response and might be translating again before speaking it. So any of us who have taken language classes know that that takes a hot minute. If anybody were to ask me a question at any point during my language education, I'd be like, hold on, I'm going to need a second, right? And researching the international populations, international student populations that you serve is really helpful, right? If you can break down beyond the regions that we talked about and, you know, work more with, okay, I have a lot of Southeast Asians in my population, or I work with a lot of students primarily from Vietnam, or I have a lot of students from Ghana, or, you know, from Canada, from these different regions, right? To be able to know specifically about kind of some practices, the educational background that they're coming from, cultural pieces can be really important there. I think a lot of times I see in like intercultural or diversity trainings and things like that that talk about like international communication, I hear a lot of like, in Europe, personal space isn't as big as it is in the US. And so European people like to be a little bit closer than normal, or that might be normal to you. And I actually spent some time as a kid in England, and that always makes me laugh because in my experience, the English like about the same amount of personal space. You know, they are not kind of the continental Europeans in terms of like doing all of that. And so, you know, the regions really do kind of break down into those micro regions, and that can be really important. So some of the don'ts, sometimes it's really natural when, or I don't know if natural is right the word, but we have a tendency, and I am guilty of this a lot too, is that when we're speaking with somebody who doesn't speak the language that we are primarily communicating in, so we tend to speak louder. Unless you are a particularly soft-spoken person, try to modulate your voice so that you're not speaking louder than you normally would. Trailing off at the end of sentences can be really tricky. Oftentimes this is because we've, if you're me, lost your train of thought and you're not sure where things are going and you're hoping that they'll kind of just pick up what you were putting down and hope for the best. Or we kind of naturally do that, again, kind of with the assumption that the person that you're talking with knows where things are going. And that just isn't always true when you're talking to somebody from a different cultural context. So if you do notice that you're doing that, kind of catch yourself and say, what I meant to finish that with was da da da. Colloquialisms and acronyms are kind of an obvious one that a lot of us kind of get caught up in. I do this a lot too. You know, even something like GPA, like Ashley was talking about, you know, using that kind of phrasing, you know, they might not know what we're talking about with GPA. And so that's an opportunity to say, okay, it's your grade point average. And that means, and then go through and explain what the actual concept is there. So the don't assume or generalize, I think we've covered in some of the other areas, and don't really worry about correcting speaking or writing mistakes in English unless you feel like it's really necessary for their ability to communicate effectively with other people, or it's like a big kind of, you're like, nope, this is going to cause a problem down the road if you don't know quite what the right word is here. But otherwise, they're probably going to figure it out. And it causes a little bit more stress and anxiety, and a little bit of a less likelihood for non-native speakers to interact with you if they feel like there's just a lot of criticism in terms of how they're speaking English. All right, I think we're ready for the next slide. And if others have do's and don'ts that they also like, we would love to hear those in the chat. So some common communication differences that happen across different cultures is, like we talked about, appropriate eye contact in different cultural contexts looks very, very different. So sometimes it's a sign of respect not to make eye contact, and sometimes it is a sign of respect to make eye contact with somebody. So that might be something to just keep in mind if you're like, wow, this student is like not making eye contact, what's going on? You know, that might be a sign of respect, and maybe that's worth doing a little bit more research into. The amount of emotion that we express and how we express emotions vary across different cultural backgrounds. Again, we talked about personal space. Noise is another one. Ashley talked a little about that in restaurants. And that's actually something that, again, as a kid growing up in England, we were told very specifically how to modulate our noise in relationship to the space that we were in. And so Americans get actually a really bad rap in Europe for being like super noisy and obnoxious, because in Europe, a lot of these kids grow up being taught specifically, you are not supposed to be any noisier than the next loudest person in the room. And so if you're in a very loud office space, it might be beneficial, even if it's not bothering you, to close your door to help kind of manage that noise, or, you know, to suggest a different space, because that would be something that might be perceived as very distracting because it's just kind of so out of the norm, or quite rude. Nonverbal cues look really different across different cultural contexts. One of my favorite stories from my time in Hawaii was that I had a friend who went to ask her RA for a vacuum on campus, and the RA, who was Polynesian, responded with raising her eyebrows and pursing her lips. And she was like, okay, but I need a vacuum. And actually the person had told them, yes, I acknowledge your need, and there's the vacuum, with those facial gestures. And so there was a kind of a funny interaction of her trying to figure out, like, okay, what are we gonna do? You're gonna tell me where the vacuum is? And then realizing down the road that that was actually, you know, a very polite and normal interaction that was perceived as rude and dismissive. Navigating bureaucracy is another really big one that people come across in different cultural contexts. This can be really, really different. Everything from how, like Ashley talked about, how you you know, operate in lines, right? How you wait for the information that you need, to how to respond when somebody says no to a request, right? If no is actually a firm no, or if that's a negotiable no, it can be really different in different areas. Sometimes, you know, you know, we have a lot of phrases in the US about working the system, right? I try to talk to my students a lot about ways to kind of navigate around different bureaucratic blocks and things like that. I think that's a big part of what we do with advisors, and that can be a really kind of daunting process because they've never done that. Their kind of DMV process doesn't involve kind of the like sweet talking that sometimes you have to do to like get the documents that you need in place. You know, that just is kind of more straightforward. And if your person says, no, there's nothing we can do, that's like literally the last answer. So that can sometimes cause direct problems or kind of confusion with advisors because we're part of that bureaucracy in the institution, right? And so they can either see us as somebody who can be more flexible than we actually can be, or they may not ask the questions that that can provide answers and solutions because they don't know that that's an option. Okay, so we've got some scenarios now. Ashley's going to take it away with the first one. And as a reminder, feel free to put your ideas in the chat.
Okay, great. I'm just going to read this first one aloud. It says, what would you do? An international student comes to you explaining that they are having a hard time sleeping and feeling comfortable in their apartment. They state that their roommates have guests over until early hours of the morning and they are very loud. In addition, they feel that the roommates don't clean up after themselves. Why might an international student be uncomfortable addressing this with their roommate? That's the first question. And number two, how would you help the student navigate this problem? And I believe there is quite a few seconds of delay, so I'm going to just hang tight for a second and see if we get some thoughts in the chat, and then we can go from there.
While we're waiting for those, we got a great comment in the chat as well that noted that gender differences can be a little bit more pronounced in different cultural contexts. You know, as a female kind of dominated profession like advising, that can look very different. You know, the ways that either women in authority positions or interactions with women in different cultures can look quite different. So thanks for sharing. While we're kind of waiting for maybe another few ideas to maybe roll in, Ashley, do you want to share what your kind of approach to this would be?
Yes, I for sure do. So let's talk about this first question here. Why might an international student be uncomfortable addressing this with their roommate? If you think back to a few slides, we talked about those pictograms that identified some differences between cultures, and oftentimes students who are from a foreign country don't have a lot of experience in kind of initiating conversations that can be a little bit heated or can spark controversy. They may not view it as polite or proper. The idea may not even occur to them that they kind of have that right or that authority to do so. So in this situation, I think it's always good to start off this conversation by, you know, first of all, empathizing, like, oh, I'm so sorry that you're feeling this way. I would love to help you kind of brainstorm and see if we can come up with some possible solutions. I then usually move into, have you had the opportunity to talk to your roommate about this? Is this something you've addressed? And if they say no, which I think most of the time you'll find they haven't, you can say, oh, okay, tell me a little more about that. Is there a reason you haven't done that? Have you not found the time? Is that maybe uncomfortable for you? And depending on the student, you may have to dig a little deeper. Sometimes those questions will allow them to open up enough that you can move forward. And sometimes it's you simply saying, you know what, there are some really non-confrontational ways that you can start this conversation with your roommate. So maybe you and I together can go through some ideas. So you could say something like, hey, how would you feel by just asking when they're not busy, just saying, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? And let them know that it's okay to start off the conversation by saying, I enjoy living here. I really like us to get along as roommates, but I do have some concerns. Would you mind if I share those with you? And help them kind of put it in their own words and find a language that's comfortable for them to accurately state their concerns. And maybe this is even an opportunity to say, you know what, you don't always have control over how your roommate reacts. If it's a situation where you feel like maybe your differences aren't going to be solved, you can possibly talk to something like the housing office and explain, hey, I'm not sure this is going to be a good match. Is there a possibility for us to maybe switch roommates? Because of course that's something that occurs with domestic students as well. But international students may not have the knowledge that they could present potential problems that they're having a hard time solving to like an RA or someone in the housing office. So again, directing them to resources as well. I don't know, do we want to move on to the next one, Christy?
I think so. We haven't gotten any responses yet.
Great, let's go to this one.
All right, so this is the one about the late withdrawal that we mentioned earlier. So a student submitted a petition for a late withdrawal after the withdrawal deadline and was denied. They come to you for help, bringing several gifts, and ask if there's anything you can do. How do you respond? So we'll wait for some opportunities in the chat to come up. This is obviously both kind of an ethical and a cultural question, so let's lean more towards the cultural stuff if you've got some ideas, and follow your school's guidelines about gift receiving otherwise for the ethical question. Maybe some helpful background here is that the student in this was actually a real life scenario that a colleague and I encountered, that this student came from a culture where gift giving was a good way to navigate bureaucracy, and that that was kind of intended as a potential solution for that petition being denied, and to be able to change that result. If that helps in terms of responses. This is a tricky one, I think, for me in terms of kind of how you respond. My kind of thought off the bat, which I don't think is necessarily the right answer, it's just an option, is to kind of talk about it and say openly, like, I appreciate this, again, kind of in the context of your school's policy around gift receiving. And, you know, I really enjoy working with you. I think we have a really great relationship. I am really sorry that this petition got denied. Here are the options for an appeal. These are the options that I, you know, can present to you. And, you know, and I do want to let you know that, like, there really isn't any other way, and make that very clear and explicit, and kind of talk through, like, I don't know if you intended these gifts in these ways, but I just want to let you know that, like, I can't make any changes to this. It's not within my power or with kind of in my purview as an advisor. And so, you know, kind of give the opportunity to, you know, decide kind of some of the changes there, and, or the kind of the realities of what you can do, and give the opportunity for somebody to, you know, to, like, ungive the gifts if they want to, with no hard feelings. We did, yeah, so an explanation of the policy and how the policy works, The gift question is around like whether or not it's meant as a bribe or like a true token of appreciation. And that's where I think I agree that like kind of talking through those things can be really helpful. And even saying, you know, and explaining the gift giving policy, I think is a great idea. So thank you, Joyce, for that suggestion, to say like, I actually can't give gift, you can't receive gifts above this value and for this reason, right? And to be able to say the why. I think the why is a big part of what we should be doing when we're communicating with students from other cultural contexts, because that helps them kind of understand the context a little bit more. So I think in terms of time, we'll just go to the next one and kind of finish up there.
Great. So our last one, you're working with an international student who is a non-native English speaker. They tell you that they understand everything so far, but you aren't confident that they do understand. What should you do? So this is something that we addressed a little bit earlier. I don't know if we'll have a ton of time to let any thoughts filter in, but please go ahead and send some thoughts if you do have them. But just sort of going back to what we've discussed, this is an opportunity for you to kind of check in with the student. And a lot of times you can say, so what questions do you have about this specific area? Or you can say, okay, so you tell me, what do you think the next step should be? Or you tell me what that means to you. Some sort of question that's going to give them the opportunity to engage with the information you've given. And then you can sort of check in based off of their response to see if the understanding was really there. And another thing that you can do, this can be tricky, but if they speak a native language where there's like someone on your campus who speaks that same language fluently. I've done this before. You have to be careful how you do it because of course, you know, if they're working on their English, you don't want to offend, but you can always say, you know what, I'm so sorry. Sometimes I have a habit of talking fast and I know that it can be difficult to understand me. Would it be easier for you if I got someone who spoke your native language to make sure that I'm giving you the best information? Kind of turning it back on you so that you're not like, okay, you can't understand English, so let's find someone who speaks your language, right? Doing it in a little bit more of a polite way, kind of putting it back on you. And most of the time, I think that they recognize that as a kindness and that you're really trying to help them, so they're not going to be offended if that's approached the right way. So there's a possible option.
And I kind of work here, in addition to what Ashley said, I've also kind of worked closely with students on follow-up emails where they have a chance to kind of work through. They can look up words that they're maybe not comfortable with or familiar with. Or they can talk to friends. Often that kind of external network can be really helpful in context, and so sometimes doing a really good detailed follow-up over email can be a good way to address this as well. Awesome. So thank you all so much for being here with us. We apologize for our technical glitches. I think we got there in the end, but you know, it's always an adventure. So we're grateful that you were here with us and hope that you enjoy the rest of your time at UAA.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.